So my name is Kevin Pazour. I'm the executive director of the Poco Muse here in town, but I also serve as the Porter County Historian for the last 5 years. I've got a story I want to share with you, and I have to tell you, I have to give credit to my friend Steve Mockler because he is the one who always tells this story whenever we do these tours at Old City Cemetery, just off of Union Street in Valparaiso. But I'm standing at the grave marker of Thomas Pratt. And Pratt is an interesting character, and I say that because I feel like he's done no fewer than a half dozen things that could have given him notoriety. He was a grocer here in College Hill, which is near and dear to my heart because I live here in College Hill in Valparaiso. He was also instrumental in the platting of Prattville in Washington Township, where I grew up, which very much could have become the county seat. But it's his last thing in life that I think gained him the most notoriety and ended up getting him published, or at least his story, in a book in 1903. So Pratt had a premonition of his own death. And Pratt was an interesting guy, had great friends, was a blacksmith by trade, and of course a grocer in his later life, and had this dream that he essentially died. But what was different and what he recanted to his friends was he essentially knew every detail after his point of death. What was happening when he was discovered, even going through the process of planning his funeral. He told all of this information to his friends in the grocery store the next day, and believe it or not, that night Pratt actually died. So what's crazy about this is his friends taking that information. It was verified by several people, and why it made it into this national book. They took that information and they planned his funeral at the Memorial Opera House, just as his premonition had suggested. So take it for what it's worth. It's a fascinating story, and yet one of many, I think, in Old City Cemetery, and why we tell the stories we do. And hopefully you have a chance to come out and listen to a couple of them at future guided walking tours. But the best thing about Sprague is and these are notes from a family reunion, they talk about how he in his early life was an atheist and didn't believe in things, and then in his later life, and it spent a good portion of his youth homesteading in upstate New York, and then eventually made his way here with his family. And it was never clear if it was here or if it was before he came here, but he found God. And this is where I find it sort of funny that he chose this iconography of the hand pointing up, which was a common thing in the era, the idea that it's referencing a higher power or to look above. But for him, very realistically, is how he found God. He was chopping trees. He had some sense to look up. Right as a tree was coming down, it would have smashed him into the ground, and he hopped to the side, and from there on out he was a devout Christian for the rest of his life. So I have to laugh at thinking, like, yes, there is the connotation of it's referencing higher power, but for me I think it's a more practical, just make sure you always look up. He passed away in 1905, but he was just an unbelievable character. There are stories where he would openly challenge the pastor mid-sermon if he didn't believe in something. And there's all these endearing, I should say, stories of him, and maybe enduring to some extent. He loved the neighborhood children, that he would essentially employ them to gather trash. So on his property he had a foundry, and he would melt down these things like cans or even glass, and he would pay the kids. So the kids loved it because they could essentially go and buy things after. But I come across this one story, and I want to say it was in 1904, so it was probably the last time he ever did it. But he would make candy, hard candy, for Christmas time to distribute to all these kids who would work for him and bring these things. And the parents, I don't know if you could call it an editorial, but he was just like the least sanitary person. I'm trying to think of the nicest way to put this. Basically, this editorial is you have this guy with his dirty bare hands making candy and trying to give it to all these kids. Like, the parents were furious with it. But Elias Axe, and if you've ever been down Axe Avenue, that's sort of his stomping grounds, that family, he was good friends with Uncle Joe Marks. And Joe, for whatever reason, never kept things in a tidy fashion. And the line was sort of drawn, and I guess people in town were complaining. And this full story is in the History of 1912 book, or the Porter County History, created in 1912, but was sort of a retrospective. And Joe somehow decided to collect carrier pigeons and had like hundreds of birds in his barn that were just pooping on everything. And people in the downtown were so mad, they essentially filed a petition to say, you've got to make him get rid of these birds, like they're ruining everything. Well, his friend Elias signed the petition, and Joe saw the petition and never spoke to him again for the rest of his life. So he was one that was very much dead set, and when he made up his mind, that was it. But the Chicago Tribune was fascinated by this guy. And if any of you have the newspaper archives where you can look at newspapers online, I implore you to look up his name. I want to say the story ran very shortly before he died in 1905. It was front page in the Chicago Tribune with his picture, and was just sort of this total story of his life and all of what he had done, and him sort of being an oddball. And you can all take turns, because this is the interesting side. And it gives you some sense of how the borders have changed in this cemetery and have sort of moved in maybe a bit closer as development has happened. Take turns over this way. So William Talcott is like the character of all church. And in 1843, he essentially develops one of the first phonetic languages. In fact, this is something we thought, oh, you know, he probably jumped on. I don't know, learned this from somebody else, and come to find, he was sort of at the forefront of realizing that there was a great need to disseminate information to people. And by and large, not everybody knew how to read. And this was a very easy way to essentially use phonetics to turn those into books, which he had the ability to print. And he just, kind of the jack of all trades. He was very instrumental in some of the earlier newspapers here. He served as a justice of the peace and a judge in his later life. But what's fascinating to me is that his epitaph is on that other side of the stone in his phonetic language. And if anyone is interested, it's very difficult to read it. It's a neat thing to see it here, but if anybody would like the long form of it in print, we'll make sure that we share that too, because it really is neat. We have a few of his books in our collection, and essentially he continued printing from 1843 up until when he died in 1902. But just such an incredibly unusual thing, but a wonderful thing to be able to point out on tours like this. And so he was only 14 years old, and it's just sort of like a crazy thing, but you realize going through this cemetery just as much, and I didn't point it out when we were up there, but you'll notice a lot of really young occupants here, and an indication of how difficult life had to be in settling this place. Like, we have the luxury now, I think, of seeing this as sort of a developed location, but I can show you pictures, you know, prior to 1850. It was tough. There was not the infrastructure that exists today, obviously, but this is sort of that monument or that relic that exists to, you know, be able to share those stories and talk about the times past, and if anything, be thankful for the people who are here that made what we have today possible.